It's going to be a great day in the history of Christendom. We're going to massacre every Jew in the neighbourhood. To massacre the Jews? Said Huddle indignantly. Do you mean to tell me there's a general rising against them? No, it's the bishop's own idea. He's in there arranging all the details now. But the bishop is such a tolerant, humane man. That is precisely what will heighten the effect of his action. The sensation will be enormous.
It's just really, really funny. And it is, in a sense, it's bleak, and then the stuff that he's got the Boy Scouts kind of picketed around the gardens, and they end up shooting the Evening Postman by mistake. It's just very funny, and yeah, it's kind of shocking in a way, but it's, it's not whatever else it is. It's not anti-Semitic,
At about 7 next morning, the gardener's boy and the early postman finally convinced the watchers that the 20th century was still unblotted. I don't suppose, mused Clovis, as an early train bore him townwards, that they will be in the least grateful for the unrest cure.
I also feel that the unrest cure can be read as a sort of anti-Semitic story. It's so pitiless and accurate in its dissection of that kind of tendency, as it were, kind of acculturated anti-Semitism, that it doesn't really seem to me to be endorsing it. After all, what the narrator is trying to do is to discombobulate this cosy set of prejudices, and part of that discombobulation is to play on them ruthlessly.
I mean, although you might say in a sense the stories are amoral, there is obviously somebody as an author who is a very moral character. I mean, a character who is a very conventional person in a way.
The English are severe about people and sentimental about animals. Who can resist the charms of a kitten or the beauty of a bird in flight? But the thing to remember about nature, the thing that has always excited me most deeply, is that it doesn't care.
Hector Munro loved the English countryside, not necessarily in its manicured sort of home counties form, but particularly in its wilder form. He loved the idea of the continuity of the countryside, of its ancientness, and would represent the pagan side of the country and of country life, touching on nature spirits and the spirit of nature in a way that's not at all sentimental or fey.
There's a strange kind of oddity, a kind of what the Germans would call a kind of unheimlich, a kind of uncanniness about Saki's work, that there's this sort of horripilation, even as if the kind of edges of the paper were kind of prickling with erect hairs as you read the stories.
Something like The Interlopers, that's a horror story. There's no laughs in that. It's about two men in a wood who get trapped under a tree, and just when they think they're being rescued by a rescue party, they realise it's wolves, and that's the final word of the story, wolves. That's a horror story that Stephen King, I'm sure, would have liked to have written.
In my tale, Gabriel Ernest, there's a deep, deep pool, and by it a naked wild boy who moves with the animal grace of an otter. An older man becomes fascinated by him. Unfortunately, the youth turns out to be a werewolf who kidnaps a local infant and eats it.
His skill is in compression, in the succinctness of his style, the selection of the perfect word, the selection of the perfect mood of a sentence. He describes, but he doesn't waste words in description. You don't get a lot of superfluous adjectives. When he does give you an adjective, it's because he wants you to pay attention to something. And I think his depiction of the wild and this elemental quality, this something that coalesces and comes to the rescue of a hapless, vulnerable child, is his greatest achievement.
There are a few clues that Munro was gay in his short stories. Apart from the fact that both Reginald and Clovis Sangrel are somewhat effete fops. They can certainly be seen that way. Reginald especially is very much the dandy. But there are little, offhand references to Turkish baths in Jermyn Street, which are written with pretty unmistakable first-hand experience coming through.
Ethel obviously knew a great deal about Hector's life, and she was determined to present it in the most attractive way. We have to remember that at the time they were living, being homosexual was a crime, and it was sure ruin for a writer. They had watched what happened to Wilde.
Part of his subversion of his class and his time comes from his sexuality. It's there for the reader to find. This is not just, early 21st century looking back. I really think it is there to be discovered, and I think he meant it to be discovered by the discerning reader. It's there in his rejection of conventional family life. It's there in his rejection of the sentimentalization of children. It's there in his embrace of kind of Pan and the spirit of nature. It's there in his kind of love of a certain kind of alfresco cavorting, which has to be described, through the lens of sport or hunting, but clearly stood proxy for other more sensual delights.
He came up to London the year after the Oscar Wilde trials, and the atmosphere, if you read the press at the time, was absolutely fevered.
I've said that I'd like to celebrate Saki as a kind of iconic gay man rather than a kind of martyred gay man. I think that after Wilde's conviction, there's a tendency to view the kind of gay English writers of almost the next half century as in some sense a terribly oppressed and terrified group in that way.
Because it was so important to Saki to keep his relationship private, in his diary he would acknowledge some days with a squiggle. And looking at it, it seems to me quite clear, certainly not absolute, that those squiggles represented days that he found a young person in the Baltic or St. Petersburg to enjoy physically.
Down Piccadilly, dilly, 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 round by the...
Ethel called them my waifs and strays, the young men who accompanied me to stay with her. With a Nelsonian disregard for what was in front of her eyes, she insisted they were the walking proof of my charitable nature. In the Jermyn Street baths, where I would go for relaxation and recreation, there wasn't an enormous amount of altruism on view. A kind of suppressed excitement, rather, held within eyes that in a moment could become very knowing. It was when I was nearing the age of 40, with the skin a little sallow, a little looser, the teeth a little discoloured, and hair a little finer, that charity became something of an issue with the waifs and strays. Some became downright insistent on it, and the margin between a handout and blackmail became increasingly hazy, tiresome, unpleasant. Perhaps it was fortunate that other matters arose to claim my interest. Corinthians 13:11. When I became a man, I put aside childish things. I was already reporting on Parliament, already aware of the threat as Germany armed herself. Yet on demand I was writing more and more of the lighter stuff at the very time I felt I had no more in me. I didn't want to write any more about the idle young, the spoilt lapdogs of society. It was not appropriate. And what matter awful aunts when the Kaiser's moustache cast a shadow over Kent? What use is pagan Pan against the mighty dreadnoughts? Now, when I thought of glorious youth, it was of the Boy Scouts, whom in my novel When William Came I portrayed, and I think rightly, as our hope for the future. That book was commended by Lord Roberts. Bobbs, England's greatest soldier. I could not have been more proud if I'd been awarded the Victoria Cross.
Munro put his publisher under some pressure to get When William Came out in 1913 as a very real warning as to what was going to happen if Britain was unprepared in the war that was undoubtedly going to come.
It's easy to forget that Munro was a journalist. We remember him for his short stories and his novels, but he was very much a political animal. Even when he wasn't, as it were, on duty, he was interested in what was going on in Parliament, and he was present when Edward Grey made his speech when it finally became clear that England was going to go to war. And he talks about the strain, the stress, the tension of this long speech, how one could feel oneself sweating with the strain of it, and the great release of tension and emotion when the outcome was finally clear.
The First World War started, theoretically, because the Germans were insisting on expanding to the east. In fact, the strange thing about the anti-German feeling in 1914 or before was it was much more pronounced amongst ordinary people than it was amongst the ruling classes. But there was a terrible feeling in Britain that the Germans were taking us to the cleaners in almost every way. They got more battleships than we had. They were selling more abroad than we had. And there was that feeling that the Germans were a competitor which are going to overtake us, which in many ways they were. Their economy was expanding faster than ours. They'd done all sorts of things to cause us embarrassment. They'd won the blue ribbon of the Atlantic. Heavens above, the Germans have had a liner which got to New York faster than any of the British liners. So there was this great feeling of competition amongst, shall I say, working people and professional people.
It's quite clear he'd made his own mind up that, like a lot of men of his generation, he would go, despite the fact he was over 40 years of age. And there's a rather nice story that just at the beginning of the war he had dinner with a friend of his and said that, well, since I wrote a book called When William Came, I really ought to go and meet him halfway.
There's a sense in the stories, in the novel, in Saki's writings of a kind of fatalistic acceptance that you read about elsewhere in the Edwardian period, a kind of fatalistic acceptance that this great kind of monolith, this ideation of what England / Britain was about to crumble and fall away.
When war was declared, I enlisted at once. The very first day, as a simple Tommy, a man. A simple man who didn't care a jot when his front teeth were removed by an army dentist. I had a plate, a serviceable plate for a serviceable man. No one could have been farther removed from those eau de cologne types who were more interested in the quality of their furnishings than the safety of their country. On my first leave from France, I met up with Charlie and Ethel in London. They were not surprised at the purposeful man their brother had become. So there we were, happy together again in our middle age. High-spirited even. Ethel, dear Ethel, being Ethel, rather let her high spirits get the better of her. At the station, as I waved farewell, she leant over the barrier to shout, "Kill some for me!" Back in the trenches, an awful thing happened, and I fought it. Another of my convenient illnesses, a fever. No, I won't have it. Not here, not now. This is not the boy who failed in Burma. I rise from my sickbed, I decline good advice because that is the correct response to good advice, and I take my place among my fellows. The day of the attack is postponed more than once. Then, in the darkness of night, we march to the trenches in front of Bertrand Corps.
Certainly, when he was in the trenches, a number of people whom he'd met at dinner parties and in clubs and so forth said to him, "What are you doing here?" and offered him commissions, and he turned them down. If he'd accepted one, perhaps he would have lived through the war.
Hector Munro turned out to be a very fine soldier. He fought in 3 actions, first Vimy Ridge, which was not terribly successful, Delville Wood, which became known as Devil's Wood for the number of men killed in an area the size of the square mile, and of course at Beaumont Hamel. And strangely enough, we have a record from an army friend of his about his behaviour at Delville Wood, which was a very close fought action. He says, "Hector on this occasion even surprised me, who'd always tried to emulate someone worthwhile. He stood and gave commands to frightened men in such a cool, fine manner that I saw many backs stiffen, and he was responsible for the organisation of a strong section, giving them a definite front to face and a reassuring word of advice." Now that, I think, shows a first-class frontline soldier. The 22nd Battalion Royal Fusiliers was actually held in reserve at the early part of the Battle of the Somme, and it's not until the final phase of the battle that they're moved up to a town called Beaumont-Hamel, and Hector's battalion is put out to one side to control the left flank. It's a very dark night. There's a mist rising early in the morning. The battle is dying down. The men are beginning to relax. An English officer apparently calls out to a friend of his, and a man relaxes and lights a cigarette.
"Put that bloody cigarette out, Jim!"
We obviously lost him too early, but we didn't lose Saki when he was shot. We lost Saki years before that.
Any writer's lasting legacy is to continue to be read. Better to be read than dead. He continues to be read. No author can ask for more.
Saki's stories are highly relevant to any society in which convention is confused with morality, and all societies confuse convention with morality, so he'll always be relevant.
I think Hector Munro, the writer Saki, can best be summed up by one of his own phrases: golden and equivocal.
I've actually got a private theory that he is, in fact, the godfather of modern British comedy. I mean, if you look at some of his names, for example, I mean, Phil Boyd Studge, The Story of a Mouse That Helped, that could be a Goon Show title. I mean, Ada Spellvexit and Bobby Churmbacon, to name two of his characters, they could be straight out of Monty Python. We know people like Alexei Sale and Jeremy Dyson from the League of Gentlemen are fans. And coming right up to date, I mean, you look at something like The Mighty Boosh, that's got a fair bit of weird English sort of language comedy, but also pagan goings-on and talking animals. So it's tempting to kind of say you can draw a thread all the way through, which makes him, you know, the godfather of modern British comedy, or if not the godfather, then perhaps the slightly eccentric bachelor uncle who sits in the corner with a wry smile on his face and probably a wolf at his feet.
So that Bodleian interview. An unbiased portrait of me? Oh, possibly not.
Would you agree with the saying that travel broadens the mind?
Oh no, quite the opposite.